Hello and welcome to the Underappreciated Animals podcast with Hatchling Makes, an animal-themed podcast filled with fun facts about species which aren't always the main feature in nature documentaries, but are getting a chance in the spotlight because they are amazing and they deserve some attention too. My name is Tash and I am a wildlife artist and lifelong animal lover. I run a small business called Hatchling Makes where I sell wildlife-inspired enamel pins and stickers, and every sale helps to raise money for wildlife conservation. In each episode of this show, I will be chatting about a different underappreciated animal, from horseshoe crabs to cassowaries to rock hyraxes and everything in between. I'll be sharing fun facts and telling you all about these incredible species, from where they're found to what they eat to just what makes them so special. Before we go any further, I do want to add in a tiny disclaimer. I am not a wildlife professional in any way, shape, or form. I am just an extreme animal lover, but I will do my very best to research these creatures to the best of my abilities so I can bring you their stories as accurately as possible. So without further ado, let's dive on into today's episode. Hello friends, welcome back to the Underappreciated Animals podcast. As you heard in the intro, I'm Tash, and as you've probably guessed, I am your podcast host for this show. This is episode 3 of this podcast, but if you've been around to listen to the last 2 episodes, you'll know that this isn't a story-based podcast. You can skip around and listen to these episodes in any order you like, but do check out the other episodes if you love animals, which I hope, seeing as that you are listening to this, that you do. Today's episode is sort of a tribute episode as we will be talking all about the amazing walrus. If you are in wildlife or conservation communities online, then you'll know about the very tragic story of Freya, the walrus in Norway, and we will chat more about her specific situation later on. But this episode is very much sort of my ode to Freya and walruses in general because I have loved them for years. As always, I will be chatting about everything to do with walruses, from their different species to what they eat to exactly why they're often seen climbing on boats. So let's dive into what makes walruses so great. Now, walruses are a pinniped, which is the scientific order which includes seals and sea lions, but they are the only member of their genetic family. There are 2 subspecies of walrus, the Pacific walrus and the Atlantic walrus, and really the only difference is geographic. They look basically the same. There is also sort of a controversy in the scientific world about the existence of a 3rd subspecies called the laptov walrus. They were recognized as a subspecies of walrus in 1940, but with very little data to go on, and the laptov walrus and the Pacific walrus seem to inhabit the same sort of general area. Hence the controversy. Some scientists believe that they are just localized Pacific walruses, and some believe that they are a totally different subspecies. So for the purposes of this episode, we're going to go with the 2 generally recognized subspecies of walrus and sort of include the laptov walrus in with the Pacific walrus. But who knows, maybe in a few years or even in a few months, research will determine that the laptov walruses are their own subspecies. And that is what is amazing about animals. We are constantly learning about them all the time and making new discoveries. And in that way, science really is incredible. So let's talk specifics. Starting with the Pacific walrus, so they are found in the northern Pacific Ocean, in the Bering Sea, which is up between Alaska and Russia. But they migrate even further north into the Beaufort Sea, which is above Alaska, and also into the eastern Siberian Sea and the Laptov Sea, which is above Russia on the map. Atlantic walruses, on the other hand, are found in the Atlantic Ocean. This is another case of really inventive name-calling when it came to coming up with the names for the different species. If you are looking for an Atlantic walrus, you want to head to coastal areas between Canada and Greenland, and they can be found up around the island of Svalbard, as well as in the Kara Sea, which is above Russia. If you're a UK or a European listener, Atlantic walruses are the ones that we very occasionally see around the UK and in Northern Europe. Now, it's really hard to explain how these 2 populations are separated, but there is no overlap at all in their territories. So if you imagine that you are looking down from above at a globe, and Canada is on your left and Russia is on your right with the Arctic Sea in the middle. Imagine a circle, which is the Arctic Sea, and those 2 countries either side, again, Canada on the left, Russia on the right. Pacific walruses are found in the top third of that circle, and Atlantic walruses are found in the bottom third. So the Arctic Sea actually separates them, which means that their populations do not mingle at all. Now, in terms of how they look, like I said right at the start, both subspecies of walrus are basically the same. The Pacific walrus is a little bigger than their Atlantic cousins. Males can be almost 4 meters long, which is really big. That's about 13 feet. And they can weigh up to 1.5 tons, which is about the weight of a 1979 Volkswagen Beetle. For comparison, an average adult male human is generally around 200 pounds or about 90 kg. I feel like a lot of this podcast is me talking about how much bigger these animals are in real life compared to how we all perceive them on nature documentaries. It's just so hard to get a scale for these animals without actually seeing them in real life. Basically, a walrus is huge. Now, baby walruses are adorable. I saw a post on social media recently that said that baby walruses are basically giant toddlers in velour tracksuits. And I feel like I can't top that as an explanation for how they look. That is better than any analogy I could ever have come up with. Now, obviously, the first thing that everyone thinks of when they think of walruses is their tusks. Walrus tusks are actually long canines that continue to grow throughout their life, and both males and females have tusks, and they use them for loads of different things. One of my favorite walrus facts is that they use their tusks to haul themselves up onto the ice. Obviously, they're big animals, and flippers are only so useful, so they can whack their tusks in the ice. Probably not whack, but you know what I mean. And that gives them some leverage to haul themselves out of the water. And it's thought, and I think this is really cute, but it's thought that this particular habit is why walruses are also known as tooth walkers, because they use their tusks to haul themselves up, and I guess it looks a little bit like they're using them to walk. They also use their tusks to make breathing holes. So if they are swimming under the ice and they need a breather, they can use their tusk to break the ice apart and give them a breathing hole. Which begs the question of how exactly do they do that? And I spent ages trying to search for photos or videos of them doing this, and I couldn't find any. So the only way that I can think of is that they swim on their backs underwater and then jam their face upwards towards the ice because their tusks bend inwards towards their body. So this is not the easiest thing for a walrus to do. I do want to quickly touch on hunting here because, a bit like elephants, those tusks do mean that they have sadly been hunted by humans. So walruses are a protected species. There's about 200,000 Pacific walruses left in the world and 25,000 Atlantic walruses. So that's quite a big difference. And historically, they have been hunted for everything from their tusks to their blubber to their coats. Certain indigenous groups can still hunt walruses, but I'm not going to go into this much because honestly, I couldn't find a lot of credible sources. Most places do say that there's a bunch of regulations in place for indigenous groups to not wipe out the walrus, and they do only get permission to hunt them because it is integral to their way of life. But I did want to touch on hunting now because walruses have been hunted for their tusks, which is a bit sad. Walruses also have loads of short bristles on their muzzles called vibrissae. I really hope I've said that right. And they use them to help them to find food. So they will snack on mussels and crabs and clams, and when they find them using these bristles, they will sort of hoover them up out of the sand. And then once they've had a good meal, they will haul themselves up out of the water and rest so that the meal can turn into blubber, which sustains them. And that is also why walruses are often found more around the coastal areas rather than out in deeper water. And it also doubles up because then they can rest on the beaches or on nearby ice floes when they're not in the water. I just want to add in here as well that blubber doesn't just keep a walrus warm, but also keeps them buoyant. In my head, I'm just imagining a really buoyant walrus unable to dive down and get a meal. I know it absolutely doesn't work like that, but it really makes me chuckle at the mental picture. So speaking of ice floes and walruses taking a rest, I think that very nicely brings us on to Wally and Freya, the walruses that were spotted around Europe in 2021 and 2022 respectively. Both of them made headlines because they were spotted chilling on boats. They did also sink some boats accidentally. I think mostly that was like rubber dinghies that when they use their tusks to try and haul themselves out the water, they sort of punctured the dinghy and sank it. It's not funny, but it also kind of is. It's hard to find out exactly why they decided to get onto the boats in the first place, but because walruses generally relax on ice floes, it could just be that they were mistaking the white boats for ice floes, or that they were just tired and it was the nearest floating thing that they could get on and they needed to have a rest. I mean, they swam really far south, so they were probably a little bit exhausted. So, in the case of Wally the walrus, he was, I believe, the first walrus ever to be sighted in Cornwall. It's really rare that walruses come so far south, which is why Wally and also Freya were such huge attractions, because when else do you get to see a walrus in the wild? Wally sank a few boats in a couple of days, and so I think it was the Irish authorities, actually built him his own floating pontoon. So he could have his own private place to rest and to try to keep people away from him. This is the double-edged sword, I think, of seeing an amazing animal like this in the wild when we don't get to see them very often. A lot of folks wanted to see Wally and they tried to lure him to them, and they drove their boats really close to him, which was visibly stressing him out, which was really sad. In the end, Wally moved on from the UK of his own accord, and he was later spotted in France and Sicily, and then he turned around and made his way back up to Iceland and seemed to be heading back further north, which is great news. As I was researching Wally, it reminded me of traveling around Europe when you finish school. I love this idea that Wally was out exploring the world, and then just when he saw everything he wanted to see, he was like, great, been there, done that, gotta get back home now. I feel like there is a children's book waiting to be written where he tells his kids about his adventures through Europe. Anyways, I'm digressing, so let's move on and talk about Freya. Now, Freya was famously doing the same thing as Wally, but she chose instead to head to Norway rather than to France. Now, I think it's really important to say that in both Freya's and Wally's cases, that the walruses were feeding in the local area, so they had a natural food source and they were just doing what walruses do. And as I said earlier, they were both getting visibly stressed out because tourists were coming way too close and not respecting the wildlife. Now, if you don't already know, Freya was sadly euthanized by the Norwegian government in 2022 because despite repeated warnings, the public weren't leaving her alone and were actually trying to entice her closer so that they could take photos. And no matter how you look at it, it's really sad that we as humans were so self-involved that we couldn't appreciate these animals from a distance. Walrus attacks on humans are rare, but they can happen, and you definitely don't want to stress out any animal to the point where it attacks you. In the case of Freya in particular, she actually chased a woman into the sea who had gotten too close to her, and that's not a nice thing for either party in that situation. I think it must have been really stressful for Freya to feel like she had no other choice but to physically chase a woman away. And I think we can all relate to wanting a little bit of private space to ourselves. People were even swimming with Freya, which was also taking a massive and really unnecessary risk, because at the end of the day, she was a 600 kg animal. I mean, imagine if she had slapped you in the head with a flipper because you decided to swim next to her. That would have given you much more than just a headache. I think if there is one thing that I hope everyone takes away from this episode, it's that we as humans need to be better behaved around animals in nature. And if the scientists and the conservation organizations are saying to leave an animal alone and observe from a distance, then we need to do that. Of course, it's amazing to see wild animals. There's a whole industry around having these amazing experiences where you can go whale watching or see the penguins. But it's so important to practice safe conduct around wild animals, not just for them, but also for us. We hear every year about tourists in Yellowstone getting hurt by bison because they got too close, or close at home, closer to my home anyways. Here in London, people every year get injured by deer in Richmond Park because they got too close. Whew, that felt really heavy. Okay, we're gonna head back to some more walrus facts now. So walruses are one of those animals that I think we all realize when we look at them. They are a bit like penguins, they are a bit clumsy on the land. But then in the water, they are absolutely in their element. In actual fact, walruses are pretty fast on land, and they can move as fast as an average human running. You wouldn't think that looking at them, would you? Of course, in the water, they are even faster, and they can clock in at about 25 miles per hour if they need to. And orcas are one of the walrus's natural predators, so I guess if you are being chased by an orca, then that burst of speed really is a matter of life or death. Now, one of my favorite things to do is finding out the collective nouns that we have for animals. And walruses have loads. They can be called a herd of walruses, or a pod of walruses, or my personal favorite, a huddle. A huddle of walruses. I think that's so sweet. And going back to that image of a baby walrus being a giant toddler in a velour tracksuit, I feel like it's also very apt. And whilst we are talking about huddles of walruses, male walruses are called bulls and the females are known as cows. And the herds are generally divided by gender. So the females will have their own herd and the males will have their own bachelor herd. And then they will come together to mate. And during mating season, there's literally thousands of individuals all coming together. In 2020, there was actually a herd of over 3,000 individuals found together in Russia. So during mating, what will happen is that the male walruses will fight each other to become the dominant male on the beach. And then when they're the dominant male, they get control of that harem of females. It's the whole survival of the fittest, the strongest one wins kind of thing. Female walruses will give birth to one pup. Very, very rarely they might give birth to twins, but generally it's just the one. And that pup will be able to swim from the moment it is born and will stay with its mother for 3 years. Then if it's a male pup, after 3 years, they will head off and find their own bachelor group to hang out with, and the females will remain with the herd. So I've mentioned before that walruses are a protected species, but weirdly they are listed as data deficient on the IUCN Red List. It's agreed that the Atlantic walrus population was decimated by hunting in the past, and their populations are still struggling to recover. In addition, climate change affecting the ice means it really impacts walruses, as there's less ice for them to rest on and to raise their young. It also decreases their feeding areas, because if there's no ice in their former feeding ground and no beaches around, then they can't haul themselves out after foraging and turn their food into blubber, so they're using up that energy immediately. So it means that their feeding grounds are shrinking as they come in closer and closer to shore. The good news is that you can help. WWF joined up with the British Antarctic Survey and launched a project called Walrus from Space, and it's basically a way that anyone can get involved in helping to save walruses. You can sign up, and then using satellite images, you count how many walruses you see. That data is so important to conservation to monitor walrus populations. It began in 2021, and you can do it right from your laptop at home, and I will leave the link to that in the show notes. And I think on that note, we are going to end this episode here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed listening to all my walrus facts today. And until next time, take care, folks. Thank you so much for listening to the Underappreciated Animals podcast. I hope you found this episode fun and interesting. And if you did, then please reach out. Let me know. I would love to hear from you. If you love animals and you would like to help support this podcast, you can check out my website for my small business, Hatchling Makes, which you can find at hatchlingmakes.com, or if you head to the show notes, I'll leave a link there. It's got wildlife-inspired enamel pins and stickers and stationery and all that good stuff. Plus 10% of every sale is donated to wildlife conservation. Also, if you have a moment to leave me a review, I would be super grateful. That really helps me to know that I am sharing the animal stories that you want to hear. You can also discover more underappreciated animals by listening to the other episodes, which are available wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe whilst you're there so you don't miss out on any future episodes. New episodes will come out every other week on a Friday. I'm also taking animal suggestions, so hop on over into the show notes to find out how to do that if you have an animal you'd like me to highlight on the show. Bonus points if you mention one that I have never heard of before. That's all from me. Until next time, take care, folks.